Dear members, dear friends, I'm very privileged today to host a session, the second in a series called Navigators. As you know, we were hosting Francis Fukuyama about 2 weeks ago, and today it's two friends of mine, one based in India at Pune, a former foreign secretary, Vijay Gokhale, as well as Parag Khanna, who is possibly known to you as the author of very interesting and provocative books. He is in Singapore. Now, it is for me a great pleasure in order to start this session with basically saying that we are looking at China from the outside in. I mean, we have 1,700 members across China. Fukuyama gave us the global view. We had a long session in May with lots of European VIPs, politicians, and think tankers, such as Timothy Garton-Ash. And we will basically continue after the elections next week with Bob Zoellick and Madeleine Albright looking at China from the US. So today it's Asia looking at China. And it's wonderful to have, first of all, Vijay on the line. Vijay used to be, that's how I got to know him, ambassador of India to China, but he was equally more also engaging with us as Europeans because he used to be ambassador of India to Germany, so that connected us right away. And then he became a foreign secretary of India after he left China. He's now retired, sitting in Pune. And we have Parag Khanna, of course, you know, managing director of FutureMap, and his books I read, Connectography. I met him first in Switzerland when he was giving a talk. And Parag, you're really eloquent, so I'm really looking forward to this session. So with that, I pass on to Vijay. The system is we have 1 hour. We will basically listen to the conversation. If the two of you bore us, we step in earlier. And if it's interesting, we actually might at the end then open up for questions from you members. We have our chief censor, Jacob Gunter, in Beijing, sitting, monitoring your questions coming in via the chat box. And in 1 hour, we close shop, and I'm sure we all will be enlightened. So Vijay, over to you to India.
Thank you, Georg. And thank you very much for inviting me to join with Parag in this conversation. And a good morning from India to all your viewers and members of the European Chamber. Let's get right down to it then. Parag, you know, you've written a couple of interesting books, of course, but also very interesting articles, essentially relating to China. Now, the latest one that you've written in October has a certain hypothetical basis to it. You use the word entropy. In a sense, you suggest that a state of flux or disorder is what is a permanent state, a constant, given a constant, and that power or hegemony is transient or temporary. Would you like to elaborate on this? Because I think this is the basis of your essay, that first of all, there's no guarantee that the Chinese will replace the Americans as hegemonists. And secondly, even if they do, power diffuses very quickly and even faster in a globalized world. So I think people are interested in knowing what this concept of entropy is.
Excellent. That is a great starting point. It's such a pleasure to join you. And of course, given your prior roles in Germany, are a perfect bridge for this conversation and many others as well. And Jörg, thank you much for your leadership. At the Eurasian level, I'm sure.
Parag, the quality of your sound is not very good. Actually, it was better when you
China in that trans-Eurasian conversation. So I'm delighted to be joining you. And I believe that, and okay, how about now? Is that better?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay. And my video is on as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. And I believe that, you know, to have a conversation, this is not just about Asia and China per se, because Asia's weight in the world is so significant that to be provocative, I would say that prior conversations that look at a so-called global view of Asia, that is not logically compatible. Asia is such a preponderant share of what is the world that one cannot have a global, nothing is global. The word global cannot be used accurately unless you are actually taking in a wide range of Asian views. So I have great respect for Francis Fukuyama, for example. He's a personal friend, a mentor. But I think that we can no longer afford to have parallel conversations where there is some notion of a global view versus an Asian view or a Chinese view. And that's a very, very important segue directly to Vijay's question about entropy. Because the truth is that I'm talking about a systems characteristic. We are talking about a global system. Even in a world that appears to be diffusing or fragmenting into regional zones, a North American zone, a European zone, an Asian zone, the fact is we have a global system because of the interdependence and the degree of competition among these players. Now, the British Empire sustained itself for a couple of centuries. When we think about American imperium, just 20 years ago, we were predicting that the 21st century would be a continuation of America's late 20th century preponderance of the world. But it all fell apart relatively quickly in terms of the weaknesses being exposed. Now, my argument is that entropy is part of this acceleration of history, if you will, and the cycles of power, the cycles of feedback, the cycles of diffusion of technology and capability are happening so quickly that to the extent that China was going to have a moment as number one, it would be much shorter lived than any other power has experienced in the past because everything is moving faster. And hence my argument that China may be beginning to decline before it even reaches its peak because power is diffusing that quickly. And the reaction to China's rise is actually more important than China's rise itself. And this is how you take a systems view and a complexity view of the world, rather than a view which is a very linear, simplistic, in international relations theory, we call it the billiard ball model, right? But the truth is it's not a billiard ball world, right? It's a world of constantly colliding forces. So that's just as a preliminary statement on this.
Yeah, so I'll take it from there then, Parag. When you say that China is peaking, I think you need to explain that a little bit because as of now, if you look at the post-COVID situation, the Chinese are the only economy or major economy which is doing substantially well. If you look at the outcome of yesterday's plenum, they have a plan for the next 15 years on how to grow that economy. And as of now, there don't seem to be any other alternatives available to the rest of the world. So I know that in your essay, you've used the word peaking in the context of peaking of oil demand. In other words, it doesn't matter how much of reserves there are, the
right.
Demand has peaked, and therefore whoever is sitting on reserves are not really going to benefit from it.
Right.
But at this stage, I don't see any other reserve in the world which we can go to, or any other new sort of energy that we can go to other than China. So how do you say that China has already peaked and might be declining?
In a marketplace, it's not about whether there is only one vendor or another vendor. In a marketplace, you have multiple choices, and a market produces supply. So I use the analogy of oil. I say China is peaking in the sense of peak oil. Now, we have unlimited supply, actually, of oil, right? We have reached peak oil demand, not peak oil supply. We can continue to produce oil from Saudi Arabia, North America, Brazil, and many other places in perpetuity. But where is the demand for that oil? It is actually declining, right? Now, at the peak of the Soviet Union, at the peak of its powers, was there a global demand for Soviet leadership of the world? Of course there was not. The marketplace, meaning all of the consumers, all of the nations, very few actually desired global Soviet leadership. Now, today, you have a marketplace of service providers in diplomacy, market power, military provision of security, provision of infrastructure finance, provision of technology goods. provision of capital in financial markets, and provision of actual hydrocarbon energy itself or clean tech. These are all of the services that we provide for each other. And the truth is that China has a leading position in a couple of these areas. China is the largest provider of infrastructure finance, but it's not the only provider of infrastructure finance, right? China has a monopoly on rare earth minerals. It does not have to have a monopoly on rare earth minerals. America gave China the monopoly on rare earth minerals through changes in its regulations and abdicating the market. China, Huawei has a leading position in 5G network telecom infrastructure. It does not have to have that leading position because, of course, Ericsson, Nokia, NTT, and quite a few other players can substitute and compete in that marketplace. So you would have to actually show me in a linear fashion that there's any aspect of global public goods that China can and must by definition provide. And you would have to, the standard we would have to hold would be the standard that we set for the United States after World War II. The United States after World War II represented 50% of global GDP, was by far the most powerful military in the world, was the only truly sovereign state left standing in many ways, right? Today, China represents about 15% of global GDP. And even with a 15-year plan, other countries are growing as well. India is growing. And the suspicion of China, as I said in the first point, is so high that we would rather that the marketplace provide the services rather than China dominating the services. So the reactions are happening faster than even China's actions.
Well, that's Parag, a point we can debate because China doesn't have to become hegemonistic in the same way that the United States became or the way that Britain became before that, because the means of hegemonism have changed in the context of the digital world, artificial intelligence, big data, and so on. But we'll come to that point. I think one of the basic points you make in many of your writings and articles is that perhaps for the first time, rather than seeing one hegemon, we are going to see a world in which there will be multiple poles in multiple continents. Now, I have two questions in this regard. First of all, there are many people who actually say that the multipolar moment passed with the unipolar moment during the global financial crisis. And what we are seeing is a bipolar moment, China and the United States. So I need you to sort of talk about that. The second point is, if you do defend your position that this is a multipolar world, then how does Europe become an independent player, given the fact that it has politically fractured as a result of Brexit? There is economic distress because of Brexit and other such problems. And really speaking, at least from India's perspective, from the perspective of Asians, Europeans haven't stepped up to the plate on COVID. I mean, these are developed countries, 27 of them, with high income, high science and technology capabilities, but no leadership during COVID. So how is Europe going to be an independent player?
Mm-hmm. So I think we have to separate these tactical diplomatic issues and questions from the fundamental analysis of what constitutes power, who has power, and how much. Just because people would like to graft the bipolar Cold War dynamic onto the 21st century, it doesn't mean that that is correct and that therefore I need to disprove it. The fact is that all power rests on economic and technological, material kinds of foundations at any point in history. And if you look at a very simple map of the distribution of economic power in the world, you see a tripolar world. You see North America, you see Europe, and you see Asia. And therefore, I do not need to make any further statements of any kind on this issue of multipolarity, right? All power is derivative of that simple fact. And the fact is the world is multipolar, right? End of story. Whether or not the exercise of that power in certain specific domains, military competition, capturing energy resources, having the highest value added in advanced technology, those are then specific sub-questions. And some powers are stronger in some areas than others. The United States, for example, still represents the majority of global currency reserves, provides, the US dollar provides that liquidity. That's an example. The American military still has utterly global operations, right? So you can measure the domains where American power is truly global and it remains very much a superpower, no matter what one thinks about one administration or another administration, whether it's doing a good job or a bad job, whether it is loved or feared, irrelevant to the issue of its capacity, right? And it has that in energy, it has it in technology, it has it in finance and military and so forth, right? Now, Europe, again, going back to fundamentals, is an economic pole of power. It is a regulatory pole of power. It is a diplomatic pole of power. When we were talking about global goods earlier, the United States claims to provide openness and freedom of navigation, protection of the sea lanes as a global public good, right? China claims to provide infrastructure through Belt and Road, and the finance of that infrastructure is a global public good. Europe represents the idea of environmental stewardship as a global public good and regulating to push and enforce that, and also promoting rights, dignity for man and so forth. One looks to Europe for those things. Also protection of citizens' rights and privacy and so forth. So Europe, again, is active in the arenas where it wants to be active. It is, in a very gradualistic way, trying to have more of an assertive, diplomatic, and some might even say strategic voice. Again, we're seeing this in response to some of the things that have happened in the last few years. Were it not for Belt and Road and for Chinese, intrusion, if you will, into the European technology and marketplace economically, you maybe would not have the response. For example, the 16+1 with Eastern European countries. Were it not for what China has done in recent years, you would not have the European reaction saying, we must have an Asia connectivity initiative. We must have an Indo-Pacific strategy. We must have a partnership with Japan on sustainable infrastructure finance, right? Why is Europe doing all of these things all of a sudden? Just like you may not have had a fiscal union coming into effect without the COVID crisis, right? Countries or entities learn from crisis and it can accelerate certain change. So again, does it matter more that China has been a first mover, or does it matter more from the long-term point of view that has caused this awakening that is forcing Europe to come together because it now has declared China to be a strategic rival? So I ask you to go forward 10 years and look back from 10 years forward and ask yourself whether China's ascent will be linear or non-linear.
Yeah, so I can't resist asking you one question. And that is, have the Europeans realized too late that the Chinese are no longer invested in the European project? In other words, seeing the European Union as an independent pole which is more aligned to them, not aligned, that's the wrong word, but certainly more sympathetic to China than the United States-led alliance system in Asia. I mean, is it that the Europeans have just realized that too late and it can't now be brought back?
Europe is I think, cleverly still trying to have it both ways. For example, Europe is taking advantage of China's policies of import substitution towards the United States. In many of the categories of industrial goods and so forth, just look at Boeing versus Airbus as the most obvious signal example. China's orders of Airbus aircraft, again, whether or not deliveries will happen and so forth, there is a different question. But clearly China commercially is tilting very strongly towards Europe and away from the United States. Just look at the bilateral volume of trade between China and America. It's fallen to about $270 billion or less. European trade with China is far larger. Look at the total volume of trade between Europe and Asia in the Eurasian space. That is more than $500 billion more per year than Europe even trades with America. So that's why European countries, some have joined Belt and Road. That's why many of them are members of the AIIB. They want to take advantage. They're pushing very hard for their financial institutions to have large onshore operations, as are Americans. So Europe is seeking to compete commercially. One of the things that I always tell my American friends is your geopolitical allies are also your geoeconomic competitors. Japan is substituting for the United States in the Chinese marketplace. Korea is, Australia is, even Canada is, and most certainly Europe is. anything that China is not going to buy from America anymore, and that it cannot yet make for itself, it is going to buy from another American ally or try to. And that's something that people have a hard time understanding in Washington. But Europe also, of course, it wants to be tougher. It wants that you cannot buy up our industries without reciprocal market access. You cannot manipulate our politics and try to carve, countries away. I constantly warn Europeans about this. I say, Europeans say Russia is picking us apart, forging gas deals and buying refineries in some countries and getting some to be, pro Nord Stream pipeline, others against Nord Stream pipeline. Then Europeans have said, even prior to that, America is dividing us, right? Good old Europe versus new Europe, those who support the Iraq war and Afghanistan war and participate, and those who oppose it, right? Old Europe versus new Europe from the American point of view, dividing Europe, Russia dividing Europe. And now Europeans complain, China is dividing Europe, creating the 16+1, getting Italy to join Belt and Road. At some point, I say to friends in, I say this all the time in Brussels, in Berlin, in Frankfurt, in Paris, say, when are you going to stop complaining about other people dividing you and start acting like a coherent supranational
Yes.
that you are supposed to be? Because an entity as wealthy, as powerful, as stable as Europe should not, if 3 times in 20 years that I can recall in my still, I think, relatively young life, I can recall these three major episodes of Europe pretending that it is a victim. And that is unacceptable for us, you, me, your, others, who want Europe to be strong, who know that Europe is capable of much a higher degree of diplomatic coherence and competence. It's unacceptable.
Yeah. No, I think there I agree with you. Can I shift tack, Parag, and come to the Indo-Pacific? Now, one of the points that you make is that Chinese actions, I'm not coming to the post-COVID period, even pre-COVID, let's say from roughly 2005 onwards, has brought about increasingly a group of countries with similar interests or similar concerns together. And of course, one of those is the quadrilateral, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. And of course, we've seen very recently the very harsh response and reaction that China has issued to this so-called thing of an Asian NATO and so on and so forth. Now, is this simply posturing by the Chinese? Are they really concerned? And more importantly, you also postulate or posit that a lot of the other countries are happy about this sort of a development or reassured. But do you, sitting in Singapore, actually think that ASEAN wants to see this sort of a situation where there is a growing tension in the region? Does it suit their interests?
Well, growing bipolar tension in the Pacific theater, and you and I have discussed how the Indo-Pacific is a very welcome conceptual development, right? It embodies the proper rimland geography of geopolitical lore, and that is important to create this contiguity. And the United States has been wise to adopt the terminology that India and Japan in particular coined first and foremost. And I think that is a positive development. However, in the terms of the strategic domains geographically, you and I know that the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific is a permanently multipolar theater. India itself is making the largest contribution over the last 2 decades with its investments in naval modernization, the Indian Ocean being the center of global trade and shipping, Europe still having a presence there, and the United States having a very significant maritime and strategic presence coming out of the Persian Gulf region. So there is no chance, absolutely zero, of China having a preponderant position in the Indian Ocean domain. We do not have to even worry about it. But because, again, the actions are in train to ensure that multipolarity, and no one disagrees with that mandate, if you will. Now, when it comes to the Pacific domain, ASEAN cannot be treated as a coherent entity, of course. It's very difficult to get ASEAN to make a strategic declaration. Many of the countries are too weak in terms of their economies and their strategic independence, their military independence, of which they have very little, except for a country like Vietnam. to make independent decisions, if you will. So they do rely upon the support of Japan, the United States, Australia, India, the Quad, and so forth to support both their national level development to be able to protect their maritime, their littoral waters, and to have a bit more confidence in their negotiations, with China around demarcation, around protecting certain exclusive economic zones and so forth. And so this will happen in a bottom-up, tit-for-tat, I call it jujitsu sort of fashion. Can we foresee a long-term outcome? Well, here perhaps the question is more binary in the way you suggested, where there is clearly a bipolar tension there in the South China Sea and other areas. So is there going to be conflict, or can both powers learn to sort of retreat partially? Can the United States continue to support the capacity building of Asian militaries and navies such that they can represent a significant deterrent to China trying to have a complete hegemony over the South China Sea, other than the islands it already possesses? And can China realize that there has to be some degree of accommodation there, despite it coming out very strongly in its statements and vision to have this full maritime integrity? And that's a question that we can't answer right now, but we know that that's a conversation we have to push for in order to go from this to this, right? And I think that China is capable of it. It's certainly not capable of it in terms of its political rhetoric right now in the context of the nationalism that we see and hear, wolf warriors and so forth. But it is capable at an intellectual level and potentially a diplomatic level of reaching what I have called a sort of technocratic compromise. I think that individuals such as yourself in particular could be part of a very important, back channel, a multilateral back channel that helps to come up with sort of, permanent kinds of solutions. If we look at, for example, the Philippines, on again, off again, agreeing to joint gas exploration agreements with China and taking a larger share of the revenue. China is has made certain offers like this to Vietnam in order to try to eject Western energy companies. There are commercial, diplomatic, to some degree, territorial solutions. There is a pathway to avoid war that I think is not inevitable.
Parag, isn't it a fact that irrespective of what people, people, I think, this is my sense, people in Washington, Berlin, Paris, London seem to think that all these activities that China has done in and around its periphery or proximity has immediately engendered some kind of a strong anti-China feeling. Now, isn't this not correct? Isn't it true that ASEAN, in a sense, while it might be disquieted by this, has chosen to accommodate it? And therefore, the presumption that whatever Chinese do is going to only further create a sort of backlash against them isn't really working in Southeast Asia. Because there is a view in many parts of the world that the Chinese do something and there's a backlash immediately thereafter. That isn't the fact, isn't it, in Southeast Asia?
No, again, about 15 years ago, I started using this term multi-alignment, right? Multi-alignment is the smart post-Cold War strategy for second-tier powers, which is to say they do not ally with one side or the other, they play all sides. They try to have the optimally best relations with the United States, with Europe, and with China, with India, with Russia, and so forth at the same time. And that is a very, very clever, shrewd approach. That is what you see countries like Kazakhstan doing, or Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and so forth, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines as well. And so in the same way that when you look at the countries that are participating in both the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States originally encouraged them to do, but the US didn't join, as well as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is being ratified at the moment. Of course, the largest number of countries that fit at the intersection of that Venn diagram is ASEAN countries. That's multi-alignment in trade. And that makes a lot of sense, because if we look right now, we cannot ignore the COVID context. We cannot ignore the fact that China trades more with ASEAN than it does with the United States of America. Now, if we take this lens, if we a priori talk about conversations about world order and pretend that the G2 economic relationship between the United States and China is the central axis, that's quite silly, Vijay. That's nothing less than silly, because statistically it's a rounding error at this point in terms of its significance for the total volume of global trade. China literally trades more with ASEAN. Now, in a post-COVID environment where trade is accelerating on the trajectory of regional integration, because we have no choice, and also because of RCEP, the Sino-dependency of ASEAN countries is actually part of their recovery, because China is actually recovering and growing. So why would any intelligent ASEAN country seek to alienate China right now when they could switch off the imports of those goods that is so critical to their economic recovery? No country is going to do that right now. And I don't think that it's now part also, and I think this is very important for all of the viewers here, something that you and I intuitively understand, is that post-colonial countries have now learned from the colonial experience and the Cold War experience. And multi-alignment is the new baseline, because they do not want to be Cold War pawns again, and they do not want to be colonies again. And so I think we have to appreciate that this is not just a conversation for today or tomorrow or COVID or post-COVID. Yeah. This is a permanent psychological condition. And it's a condition that most of humanity understands, because most of humanity is post-colonial countries like ASEAN countries. And the one country that understands this least, and this was a central point in my essays that you were citing, is that the country that understands this least on earth is China.
China, yeah.
And as you know, I spend, other than this year, I spend my entire life traveling to dozens and hundreds of countries. And I have this conversation everywhere. And the one place where I find it very difficult to penetrate the consciousness and the simple fact is Beijing, right? It's not for lack of intelligence, right? It's not for lack of formal study about the material conditions of countries. It's for lack of psychological empathy, right? They're not relating, they're not putting themselves in the shoes of an Indian, a Pakistani, even Pakistan, which is considered to be China's most loyal client state, if you will. They absolutely do not know the bottom-up degree of suspicion. They simply see, look, China is popular in surveys, right? China is considered a robust all-weather ally. But at the human level, the suspicion is as high of China as it is of even the United States. And they do not get why that is true. And it actually has nothing to do with them. It has to do with history, colonialism, and the Cold War, and the war on terror as well in the case of Pakistan. This is an inescapable psychological condition that is a sign of evolution. This is a wonderful thing that we have all learned enough from history to be suspicious of everyone else. It's trust but verify. And I wish for China to understand this, because I think this would go a very long way to opening up the Chinese mind to the kinds of mutual accommodations that are necessary for long-term multipolar stability.
Maybe I can just step in there myself. I think what Parag is alluding to is, you might label this as big state autism, which is something that also has afflicted the US and also the country of my wife, Russia, in many ways. Parag, to your point of the lesser importance of US-China trade, what people actually assume is 5.8% of global trade is US-China. So as a matter of fact, it is really not going to swing the needle that much. What would be interesting is to see, as the chamber just have started to do a decoupling study, where we look into the impact of technology and financial decoupling. And we hope to launch it on January 14th. What that means to Southeast Asia, and definitely in our case, of course, for Europe, because when we look into the way that the US is clamping down on semiconductor exports or high-tech exports, software and so forth, that's where European companies actually use it. So will we have a dual world? And already Xi Jinping is alluding to the fact, yes, there might be a dual world. So maybe also to Vijay, decoupling, being in a chemical company myself, we are producing these active pharmaceutical ingredients, which then are produced in China, go to India. There seems to be an appetite in India in order to decouple from that. So it's not just Europe or US and China decoupling. So maybe if the two of you could sort of relate this, where will decoupling lead us and how serious do you think it's a threat?
Okay, maybe Parag, let me step in here. Georg, decoupling between China and the United States, or Europe and the United States, is one thing. But for the rest of the world to decouple is a little more difficult. Right now, the debate that is going on in India is, should we go for Huawei or not? And I've said this on a number of other occasions. I think that's a false debate. The real debate should be, should we go with 5G technology produced abroad or 5G technology produced at home? Because the fact of the matter is that, at least to my mind, what is coming up in the world of technology is a Berlin Wall of technology. You're being forced to choose sides. Those like us, for instance, not Europe, between the Western technology, American and European, or the Chinese technology. And this is going to have implications for artificial intelligence, for big data, for service provider, and everything else. And therefore, the issue is not whether Chinese technology is invasive. Because all technology is invasive. It's just that the American technology at this point of time may be more benign for India. So the real debate is this. And this debate can only happen when the rest of the world starts innovating in technology. Otherwise, all you're doing is you're a consumer. And I say this because I feel we are going back into a techno-colonialism as a result of this. So that's my perception. I don't think decoupling is really a possibility. It is in segments. Okay, so pharmaceuticals, India has a strong base of production. APIs used to be made in India before we were hollowed out by the Chinese in 2005. It's coming back. You're protecting a key segment of industry for exports. But I don't think decoupling across the board is an option for countries other than the United States, Japan, and West Europe. I don't know what Parag's view in this is.
So this is where the idea, the reality of technological entropy comes in. Again, this is not just a concept to help to unlock this question. This is the most powerful, consistent iron law of human history. Technology diffuses. We can begin every sentence with that point so that it is abundantly clear at any point in any conversation that you cannot control technology. You cannot lock it in a box. And therefore, if we are appreciating the magnitude of that fact, we would not pretend that a bipolar technological system is an inexorable reality, not even today, let alone into the future. Because if you just look at AI, right? AI as a service. India is becoming one of the fastest growing markets in that regard. There's a reason why Google and Amazon and everyone is now putting more investment into India, into software and so forth, than pretty much anywhere else. So now imagine country X somewhere in the world has to choose who is going to do their big data systems and so forth. Do they have to go with Baidu? Do they have to go with Tencent? Do they have to only go with Microsoft? Of course not. There'll be an Indian competitor. TCS will help to finance. TCS has a larger market cap now than most Western consulting firms, right? Is a third option. In quantum, that will be the case. When it comes to just 5G hardware, it's Japan, it's Europeans, Americans. If America had an industrial policy, right, and if American companies didn't have such a home market, which they're so busy with, they would gladly compete more internationally as well in this regard. So again, Huawei's global market share is coming out. And let me make a second point why I think it's important to not view this sort of permanent technological decoupling. It's also because China's own incentives could change. And that's something we often forget. If you think about the experience that Huawei is going through, that ByteDance is going through, that SenseTime, if not yet will go through, right? They will be so restricted in the international marketplace because of their firm structure, suspicions about China, the reactions and the outcry, and the attempt to provide better, more transparent alternatives from Western or Japanese or Indian suppliers, that Chinese companies simply will not grow as much as they could grow. And the pressure will mount to have more of what I call an Alibaba model, right? In all of this concern and uproar about major Chinese companies having a hegemonic approach to the world, you don't hear that about Alibaba, right? Because Alibaba has a way of being a sort of transparent platform, if you will, right? You can use any credit card on Alibaba. You don't have to use Union Pay, right? Alibaba helps you in the global SME marketplace of finance and of transactions, and helps you with your market access in China itself. Many Western companies are grateful to Alibaba because it helps them do better business in China while also helping them internationally. So the more pressure there is on the companies like SenseTime and ByteDance and Huawei, the more eventually those companies could be calling up the Beijing leadership and saying, hey, we're going to have to find some middle way because we are really reaching the limits of growth. Forced delistings of Chinese companies internationally will obviously reduce their market cap. So they will wind up having, eminent domain, which they already have, of course, in the Chinese market, but will really, really struggle to go beyond that because the technology marketplace is in fact evolving so quickly. So, I think we agree, but the one point you mentioned, you said the rest of the world will have to, really start innovating. But the rest of the world is constantly innovating. So I, quite frankly, don't lose any sleep at night about this as I observe the dynamic, because the political pressure, as well as the innovation globally, is going to ensure a marketplace of these services. Are they going to be interoperable or not when it comes to 5G? Are we going to have common data standards? That's a question to also tackle in parallel, and that's where Europe can play a very significant role, of course, as it does with GDPR. ASEAN countries are trying to elevate their common data standard to be GDPR compliant, for example. And by the way, again, this being a very important region of 700 million people, the fact is that when you look at the technology ecosystem here, you see that companies are taking American capital, Chinese capital, as well as Japanese capital, like SoftBank and so forth. And the winners, it's not a hegemonic play. It's not ASEAN being carved up in a bipolar technology system. No, not at all. It's national champions emerging faster as a result of taking foreign capital and support. And that's the way the whole world could play out. And that would be a very good thing, actually.
Parag and Vijay, concerning sleepless nights, Jacob has been monitoring questions, and I guess he's got the right next question for the two of you.
Yeah, so this first question comes from Sophia Ma. Germany and France just released their policy guidelines for their own Indo-Pacific strategies for the first time. So what do you think the implications of these sorts of policy papers are? What do you think they mean for EU engagement in the Indo-Pacific? And how do you think Asian countries are going to respond to this shift?
Maybe I'll go first, Parag.
Yes.
Let me give you India's perspective. I think European political presence, and I've been careful to distinguish between political presence and a military presence, but Europe's political presence in Asia, except for China, has been lacking for many, many years. Let's just take the example of Germany. It's the largest or second largest trading nation in the world for the last 20 or 25 years. Yet you can count on two hands how many times the German Chancellor has visited an Asian country other than China. France and the United Kingdom have territories in the Indo-Pacific and a substantial amount of trade. But you can again check how often they have pronounced in substantive terms on issues which have involved the Asia Pacific alone, not global issues. So I think that, and the fact is that the European Union as a group of countries is absent from Asia. Asians still have tended to deal with individual countries, with the capital, with Paris, with Berlin, with Madrid, with Rome, not with Brussels. Brussels is seen as a supra trade agency with which you have to fight on labor standards and environmental issues and phytosanitary requirements, but nothing beyond that. Now, I think the lead that Germany and France have taken in issuing an Indo-Pacific strategy is very welcome in India, and I would say in large parts of the Indo-Pacific. What we now need to see is for the Europeans under the leadership of Germany and France to take political positions in ensuring that you have a plurilateral or multilateral order. I mean, Parag and I were discussing how the Indian Ocean is going to be a multipolar ocean. Now, of course, the United States presence in Diego Garcia, the sort of UK, British presence is important. India is there. China is going to be there in a big way. You can't help it. But again, a European political presence is necessary. So I would say at this stage, it is a bit like October 2011, Hillary Clinton in Hanoi saying we are going to tilt towards Asia. Did the United States follow up on that? Well, it really didn't. Perhaps not until the Trump administration, at least. So this is a declaration by Germany and France. The proof of the pudding lies in the eating. You don't have to tilt the same way as the United States did, but you have to get more involved in the affairs of the Indo-Pacific. But I don't know what your view is.
So, I mean, the current 2+2 dialogue ongoing between, and the defense pact, as many are calling it, between the US and India, is a far more, significant strategic step than India's acquisition of submarines or other, or aircraft from France, right? Much more significant. And a US carrier doing a freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea is a far more significant step than a British battleship doing a freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea. So China probably is not particularly concerned with these Indo-Pacific white papers from the standpoint of the military shift in military dynamics. I think what is, again, Europe must lead with its strengths, which is commercial and diplomatic, or what you were calling political. On the commercial domain, Europe standing up and saying, Belt and Road must be more transparent, and we will boycott, get in the way, interfere, and actively compete to undermine and provide more competitive concessional terms of infrastructure finance to help countries not work with China on some of their major projects, actively compete on the ground in these third-party countries. That is the kind of thing that I think would be much more upsetting to China. And quite frankly, something that Europeans are very good at, really very good at doing. Look at the whole world of colonial and post-colonial relationships that European countries have. I would say exploit them while you still can, because the world still, there's a generation that has no memory of the European colonial experience, but are quite happy and pleased with Europe's presence commercially and culturally. They don't view Europe as a colonial power anymore. They view it as a very positive, high standard commercial power. That's why Jörg is so successful, right, in China, and why European companies are increasing their rate of registration and presence here in Southeast Asia, and they're extremely welcome to be doing so. But because it's done at a transactional micro level, it doesn't have those sort of that grand sort of symbolism of a defense pact. It doesn't really get noticed in terms of us marking milestones. But I do think that this process of having Indo-Pacific white papers, strengthening export credits out of Europe to boost European business here, competing with China on the ground for very specific deals, projects, contracts, teaching countries to make sustainable plans for their development that involve higher quality goods and services. This will be these are the micro steps that not only will demonstrate Europe's global influence in a very, very, very key areas, but also actually, again, turn the tide on this idea that the Chinese strategy of global hegemony through Belt and Road and so forth is destined to succeed, because it's not. If Europe does these simple things that it's perfectly capable of doing, and America also takes a more multilateral approach and an equality-based, not a bullying-based or just a rhetorical approach to these issues. If it joins, TPP, for example, and brings more American multinationals to compete, there's no question, again, that commercial and diplomatic and even strategic multipolarity is assured.
Jacob?
Dr. Khanna, you mentioned that the speed of history is accelerating, commensurate with technology, development, communications, et cetera. And it makes me think a lot about the kind of slow and steady pace of history during the Cold War, and how that speed may have given enough time for proper calculations between the US and the USSR to avoid a true and direct clash. Is it possible that this acceleration of history will start to make things move so quickly that it risks a higher chance for real great power conflict?
It's a wonderful question, and there's a yes and a no sort of answer, right? In terms of the no, I would say that remember that there is still Asian prudence, Asian caution. For 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have been hearing people saying that Taiwan in particular, South China Sea, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and others, there will be World War III. Not that it was imminent in the 1990s, but Asians will not be able to maintain great power stability without the US security umbrella and alliance system. But 30 years is actually quite a long time to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, Asian powers are actually prudent. They are capable of stepping back from the brink. We've seen India and China do it multiple times. We've seen it happen in the South China Sea. We've seen it with North Korea and others. So I would not, I think it's extremely, I think the question is brilliant, but I think that sentimentally, if questions like that still carry this baggage that it's up to China and America to decide the fate of all of Asia, it's very disrespectful, quite frankly, to the 5 billion Asians collectively who have done a very good job in the last 30 years of finding ways to maintain stability. And let's remember a deeper point, 4,000 years of Asian history is mostly multipolar. It's 4,000 years of finding ways to navigate around each other and not have, of course, there are major exceptions. Look at Japan in World War II, right? And one of the things that I highlight is that we have to learn from that experience, and that China should learn from that experience. What happens when that line is crossed, when a power goes too far, right? China is vastly more powerful than China, but again, the psychological environment and the pushback is quite severe, and I think that can play an important deterrent role with respect to China. One thing though, what I would say without being disrespectful, but being very constructively critical, is that whatever successes Asians have had in maintaining stability, it's not enough. There's a big difference between maintaining stability and resolving conflicts, and that next step is the step that Asians need to undertake, including China, of course, to demonstrate maturity. Asians can be prudent, but not yet mature or even as wise as they think they are. Because to me, wisdom would rest in solving outstanding disputes to prevent them from escalating unnecessarily or accidentally, which is something that can happen in the context of this acceleration. And it does come back to Taiwan. And one of the examples I used at the end of the second of that two-part essay was the fact that if the United States is pressured TSMC of Taiwan to not provide semiconductors to its mainland consumers and clients, then that could potentially be a trigger for China to say, well, we need to take ownership or control over those assets because we can no longer purchase them. So again, how many steps ahead are we thinking? And it worries me that, again, I think I respect Asian diplomats and diplomacy enough to see that they have managed relations well in the last couple of decades, but I'm deeply concerned that they're not being bold and mature enough to settle these disputes in a way that I know can be done amicably if they focus as much or more on that as on escalatory deterrence.
Maybe I can just finish today's unbelievable 60 minutes past with a question relating this to my own country, Germany. Both of you lived in Germany, know it intimately well. So the comparison I was asking Timothy Gart-Nash in May, will China go down the road of Wilhelminian Germany? This kind of urbanization, the kind of industrialization, the decades of double-digit growth after 1871, the kind of benign leader with Bismarck that resembles the kind of caution that Deng Xiaoping was bringing to the system. I now don't want to necessarily compare Wilhelm with Xi Jinping, but there seems to be a kind of we come too late to the party, the place that the sun is taken by the Brits, and now today, of course, by the Americans. Where do you see a real similarity, and is it going to end in, I wouldn't say First World War, but isn't it the fact that we are a little bit sleepwalking right now as well?
So Georg, let me answer that. I was in Munich in 2014 for the Munich Security Conference, and the sub-theme of that conference was that is Asia in 2014 going to repeat Europe in 1914? The overwhelming view among the Europeans was that there were great similarities. But of course, there were fundamental differences. Firstly, we aren't a bunch of countries ruled by royal families intermarrying with each other and therefore assuming that marriage itself is going to prevent conflict or is some kind of a bond. Secondly, I think it was a competition within Europe in 1914. Wilhelmine Germany was challenging Pax Britannica. And the British simply did not want to give space to another rapidly industrializing power. Now, that's not the case with Asia, where despite all the tensions that exist between Asian countries, there are more than one country growing in Asia. And that doesn't just include India, it includes the Republic of Korea, it includes ASEAN as a group. Within ASEAN, it includes Vietnam, it includes Indonesia, and so on. And while, of course, there is an effort by the Chinese to limit that, it is not in the manner that Edwardian England did to Wilhelmine Germany. So my view is that this is a false comparison. I don't think we can replicate European history in the 20th century with Asian history in the 21st century. But I do agree entirely with Parag that it is one thing to manage a conflict. It is another thing to resolve a dispute. And while we are good at the first, I think we don't have either the experience or the mechanisms to do the second. And there is always the risk of miscalculation. It's even in the Himalayan heights, going to what happened in India. It's a decision that rests in the hands of a captain in the army or a major in the army. You don't have time to consult headquarters on these things. And you know what happened in Sarajevo. I mean, one shot fired by Princep led to a world war. So I think that point of Parag's is very, very valid.
So let me echo that sentiment. Back in 2014, 2015, when the whole world, when all of the Anglophone publications had as their headlines, is 2014 the new 1914? I also violently resisted that notion. I did a long essay for the National Interest Journal, and I said, actually, 1814 is a much better comparison, not because we are in an immediate post-war, post-Napoleonic War kind of situation, but because we have a global, we have a multipolar environment already. So the reason the pre-World War I environment is not a good comparison is because of this argument that we are already multipolar. So how can this be a debate between two unipolar visions when we are already multipolar? So it falls flat on its face. The better question is, can you have a stable global concert of powers is the more significant question for today. And that requires thinking beyond just a bipolar situation. The other important reason is, again, geography and history. It's far more interesting and, quite frankly, insightful to be looking at Asia's history as a guide than Western history as a guide. The fact that we've just spent 5 minutes discussing a false analogy rather than saying, what does 4,000 years of Asian history tell us about the future of Asia, is really the reason I wrote the Asia book a couple of years ago. And I said, wait a minute, in 4,000 years of Asian history, it's been preponderantly multipolar in nature. Asian geography is so much vaster than flat and claustrophobic Europe. Why would we ever make that analogy? Geography is a countless times more important factor in these situations than simply looking at a distant historical analogy. And Asia is so large, its civilization so multiple and diverse, unlike in Europe, that we should really understand that Asia not only has the capacity for a multipolar future, that's really been largely the story of its past. So I think that we can look back at the pre-Mongol periods of Song and Tang dynasty China. We can look at even the pre-colonial periods more generally, where you had this complexity and interactions among the wide diversity of Asian civilizations, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Indian, Southeast Asian, all finding ways to compete, collaborate, and so forth, and with enormous amounts of cultural flows as well at the same time. And I think that that's perfectly within Asia's capacity. So we should always resist a priori, right at the outset, any kind of Western analogy. Not because I reject the West, right? I mean, I'm American through and through, with more of my life spent in Germany, right, than in any particular Asian country. However, that does not mean that it is the right template, right? Always understand the region from the bottom up first and foremost. So my plea would be for all of those who want to make the 19th century European analogies, the 1914 analogies, please just read more about Asian history and look for the guide to the future there. And it's a far more promising and positive picture, dare I say.
I couldn't agree more. That's wonderful, fellows. You were sparkling. We called the series Navigators because in June, we came out with a survey asking our members how they're doing in China, and we labeled it Navigating in the Dark. This spark that you enlightened today will definitely send our members thinking. I'm really grateful for this engagement. So thank you so much, Vijay, and thank you so much, Parag, for this fun session. 60 minutes could have easily been much longer. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
We will have this on YouTube.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.